Hello everybody. So in this video, I'm going to present to you some of the, in a sense, like strongest arguments for open individualism. And there's like a number of other arguments I'm not going to touch upon, but I think like these alone can take you pretty far. And the first thing I will mention is that kind of the first cracks in my previous view, which this happened when I was a teenager, a long time ago, but when I was like thinking very deeply about issues such as, like, for example, teleportation, or the idea of like fusion between people, mind melding, and wondering how is this consistent with this view of myself as kind of just a separate entity over time? And if I mind meld with somebody, what will happen? Will I become that person? Will I all of a sudden have access to their memories, or will I become a completely different person? What happens if I make a copy of myself? Will I, instantaneously be in both places at once, but then diverge as they get more information? And I was just very puzzled by all of these thought experiments. And, it actually took a pretty interesting experience for me to kind of like feel the possibility of open individualism. Again, I should highlight that even though I experienced, in a sense, open individualism as a live possibility experientially in a particular state of consciousness, the real reason why I actually continued to be attracted to it was because of its philosophical power, that it actually solves a lot of puzzles. Not because it only feels that way in certain states of consciousness. Okay, so that's a kind of like ground these. What are these concrete, what I claim to be pretty strong arguments for open individualism? So we have, first of all, I'm going to say there's kind of this class of arguments I would describe as continuity-based arguments. Which are, first of all, this idea that if, and this is a huge if, an if that, empty individualists will not necessarily buy into, but it's an if that a lot of people actually do buy into intuitively, and I consider seriously. And this if is, if you continue to exist from one moment to the next, then there's got to be something that is, in a sense, your identity carrier. Something that is actually, remaining constant from one moment to the next. Could be physical, could be metaphysical, but there's got to be something that is keeping you the same subject of experience over time. Okay, so we assume, you continue to exist from one moment to the next. Again, big assumption. I'm not going to justify it further. I'm just going to say, if you believe this, then open individualism follows. And the argument is that you will have an identity carrier. And then the thing that you have to investigate is, what is the nature of this identity carrier? And you will, in a sense, arrive at what you could describe, from logical terms, a reductio ad absurdum of closed individualism. In other words, let's assume, that you are just a individual experience from individual subject of experience over time, as like is typically felt by most humans, and basically see where that takes you. Okay, so if that is the case, what happens when you do a fission? So the classical example of fission is split brain patients. And there's a lot of controversy about this, and I'm not going to get into the details of actually like the controversy on neuroscience and psychology, but actually what happens when you split your brain in half. Actually, the corpus callosum is not exactly the same as splitting the brain in half, but functionally, at the very least, there's a huge channel of communication that is broken between the left and right hemisphere, and some experiments, controversial, I should say, it's a disclaimer, but some experiments seem to indicate that you have all of a sudden two subjects of experience. One that corresponds to the information that is like expressed or encoded and rendered in the left hemisphere, and another that corresponds to the information rendered in the right hemisphere. You have like these weird things, like, if you flash two images in front of the person, one in the left and one in the right, and you ask them what did they see, they will report whatever was in the right side of their visual field. But if you ask them to draw what they saw with the left hand, they will draw whatever was on the other hemisphere. And if you ask them, why did you draw that, they will usually confabulate. They will basically be in kind of denial that, like, that wasn't what they intended to draw, but it's pretty obvious that, you know, in a sense, they're trying to justify the result of, you know, the experiment from the other hemisphere's point of view, to which they don't have access. Anyhow, if you assume closed individualism, this is insane, right? Like this, like, okay, you have this eternal, independent soul that all of a sudden is broken into two. And if it's possible to break a soul into two, then you have this very interesting issue, which comes from this overall idea of the transitivity of identity. In other words, when you have A equals B and B equals C, it's logically necessary that A will be equal to C. And when you have, for example, a fission case, you will have an interesting scenario where basically you can think of like this as A, this as, let's see, slightly different, right? Like this is A, this is B, and this is C. That you were B at some point, then you divided, and now part of you became A and part of you became C. But you know, because of the identity carrier, A is equal to B, and C is equal to B. And by transitivity, A is equal to C, which shows that you can be in two places with two information contents represented in your experience at once. In other words, you have arrived at a contradiction that, in a sense, shows that the assumption of closed individualism doesn't hold. At least, again, with this assumption that, you know, there's continuity of yourself over time, and that there is an identity carrier that is actually determining whether it is you or not over time. Likewise, you have like fusion experiments, which is when you actually, let's say, you build a neurological bridge between my brain and your brain, and all of a sudden we have one experience, one unified experience that has two visual fields and two, you know, sensory tactile fields and two, you know, like fields of sensory, gustatory and scent experiences. And, you know, that's like really trippy. And, you know, some people might say like, okay, that's actually impossible. But at least within physicalism, there really is no reason why that would be impossible. And more so, this idea of being able to experience, you know, multiple experiential fields that are inconsistent with each other at once is something that you can already very easily do. For example, with binocular rivalry, which, you know, if you actually, you know, divide your visual field with a mirror into two places, you know, you will have kind of this strange experience of simultaneously seeing two worlds that are actually inconsistent with one another, and you will tend to shift from one to the other, but oftentimes you will actually experience both of them in superposition. Meaning, you know, there's nothing logically contradictory about experiencing the sensory input of two humans at once. You know, that's actually not a problem. There's like all sorts of exotic experiences you can have on meditation and psychedelics and, you know, like with trickeries with your senses that produces that feeling. In other words, like that's not a reason to doubt that that would actually work. And actually, we do have some fascinating cases, such as like the Hogan sisters, these girls that actually were born with a shared thalamus, which is kind of at the core of the brain and through which all of the sensory input gets routed. They may have like actually two different like cortices, so like they have like, you know, 4 lobes, but they all actually connect at the thalamus. It's pretty fascinating, and they can experience each other's sensations. And I mean, it's still currently an open question whether they're a unified moment of experience, that brain produces a unified moment of experience or not. And it could go both ways. I mean, the fact that they have independent voices, which is fascinating, you know, like they have like, to some extent, like different opinions and beliefs, but they fully kind of experience each other's experiences. There's an interpretation here, which is they are still just one experience, but that has like two, in a sense, senses of self and voices, which is totally fine. And again, we find that in the wild all over the place in, for example, schizophrenia, where a person experiences multiple voices, some of them that feel like themselves and some that don't feel like themselves. Or, for example, multiple personality disorder, where for sure you actually cycle between different, you know, feelings of self, even though you continue to be a unified moment of experience. In other words, the fact that you experience multiple voices doesn't mean that you're not a unified experience. And in that sense, I do consider the Hogan sisters to be a fascinating example of why individual human beings are probably not the units, of identity, that we are actually, in a sense, something else. So we are kind of flames in candles, that actually our true identity is that of being fire rather than being the candle in and of itself. That metaphor, by the way, is extremely ancient. It actually comes from, time before Christ in Buddhist texts. So it's, even though I thought of it myself when I was a teenager, it's actually not new at all. And I think, it's a powerful metaphor. Okay, so that was kind of the ad absurdum approach, where you kind of like assume closed individualism, and you arrive at like, okay, that cannot be the case, because you can basically create worlds where closed individualism breaks down. More so, the identity carrier question is fascinating, because you can also, for example, assume that, hey, what determines identity, the fact that it is you who are experiencing these, is a set of memories that you have. But, if you think that, then you arrive again at completely crazy contradictions when you start to examine things such as false memories or fabrications, or, people who confuse what they're like expecting to happen in the future with what already happened in the past. In other words, memories are most likely not, wormholes into your past experiences. They are rather kind of like things that are being recreated based on the patterns left behind from previous impressions, which, doesn't actually fundamentally connect it to the past, and definitely not with your, kind of like your true self over time. And in that sense, if you believe that actually what determines who you are is your memories, you are actually just this weird, fragmented, like tree-like, or if I were to use a phrase that I really like from a particular TV show, you would be a globular cluster of arborized realities, because that's just how memory gets constructed. You're not actually, a timeline. That's not how memory works. If the identity carrier, for example, was instead your physical being, the atoms that make you, then again, that breaks down so easily, because, the half-life of something like phosphate atoms in your brain is, I believe, something like 3 weeks or something like that. Even from the moment you start a sentence, the moment you finish it, the atoms in your body and your nervous system are not the same anymore. In other words, the identity carrier cannot be, what atoms are inside you. That just doesn't seem to be the case. Then you might also say, for example, okay, maybe the identity carrier is the structure of my brain, but that also is like subject to change constantly. So I don't think that would actually hold. And the overall kind of thrust of the argument is that you give me an identity carrier that you think uniquely defines you from the moment you're born to the moment that you're dead, and I will almost certainly very easily find counterexamples where that identity carrier either stops being continuously existing throughout your experience, throughout your life, or that identity carrier actually exists in multiple people. In other words, it doesn't seem to be the case that you can carefully define an identity carrier in such a way that it uniquely defines you from the moment that you're a baby to the moment that you march to your grave. That doesn't seem to exist. In other words, reality is much more fluid than that. There's actually no independent souls anywhere, in which case, actually kind of this metaphor that, we are the flame rather than the candle would seem to make a lot more sense. Okay, so I'll just try to power through some of these other ones. Parsimony. There's this saying that there's 3 numbers that reality actually, can contain, and that is 0, 1, and infinity. And, it's just like parsimony. It's like those are kind of like low information numbers, and a lot of things in physics ultimately reduce to that. It would be just extraordinary in a sense that the actual number of individual consciousnesses in the entire multiverse would be, let's say, 10 to the 500. And it's like, that's just the number it is, throughout all of eternity. That's all the numbers of selves. It just seems extraordinarily arbitrary. Then again, this is not a super strong argument, I think, but it's worth sharing. Then there's this one electron view of the universe, which is fascinating too because it was proposed by Feynman and Wiener, which are um, some of the most famous physicists of the 20th century. And in a phone conversation, actually, they kind of like postulated this idea that what we truly are is, you know, the one electron in the universe. And they arrived at this view by, for example, like actually looking at Feynman diagrams, which is a particular way of like representing quantum processes in physics. And Feynman realized that, you know, when you have a, for example, an electron and an anti-electron merge into a photon, which is one of the possible interactions that can happen in fundamental physics, you can see that in that way, but also you can see it as one electron bouncing off a photon and then starting to travel back in time. And that is because an electron and an anti-electron are actually equivalent once you reverse the time direction. In other words, antimatter is like matter, but just moving backwards in time. And at least like the math works out. I'm not sure if this continues to be the case, but at least at the time, the physics of the time seem to indicate that. And an interesting, follow-up from this is this idea that, well, perhaps the entirety of reality is actually just one electron bouncing back and forth, interacting with itself and going backwards and forwards in time, interweaving this kind of eternal or like timeless structure of self-interaction. In which case, a metaphorical way of talking about this is that the universe is actually what happens when God starts to interact with itself, and especially its future and past images of itself. It's kind of this ultimate self-consistent crystal of self-interaction. Okay, very trippy. I don't expect you to actually take this very seriously, but it's an argument. It's an interesting take on it. And finally, I'm going to mention the view from nowhere, which is actually connected to the parsimony component, but it also has kind of its own characteristic. And that is that imagine that you were able to look at, for example, the entire universe or the multiverse, whatever you want, or the scope you want to make it be, and you see conscious beings or moments of experience in the universe as kind of like flashes of light. And, they're all, in a sense, made of the same light. Maybe the colors are slightly different because they represent different things, but they're all light. And then the question is, who are you in that universe? And the thing is that, because you're taking a view from nowhere, you don't have a way of actually telling which of those flashes of light is you. And of course, from a particular flash of light, you're going to say, well, of course this is me, But there's no clear way of reconciling how that symmetry got broken from the point of view of a view from nowhere. So like if we start out with a universe that doesn't have any sentient beings to begin with, and then it kind of like fragments and it starts generating these independent consciousnesses, it's not clear at all how the symmetry could have been broken for you in particular to end up being only one of those branches, only one of those, sources of, of light consciousness. Which, yeah, from basically Occam's razor or a parsimony argument, you can say, well, actually the simplest is to say that I am all of it. I am just all of the instances of light. And it just makes much more sense. You don't require this crazy symmetry breaking operation that comes from nowhere, or the introduction of information from nowhere, which in physics is not allowed, and definitely, it's very philosophically inconsistent with a lot of things. So in this sense, we can kind of arrive at open individualism by simply taking seriously this idea that information cannot be created, that in a sense the information content of the universe is constant and perhaps even zero, and in that sense, yeah, you kind of are forced to be everybody. There's no way around it, and yeah, that would be an argument. And I think, yeah, those are some of the main and strong ones. As I said, there are other arguments as well I'm not going to touch upon, but yeah, feel free to, read through the Open Individualist wiki that is in Reddit, and you will find a whole bunch of other very interesting arguments. All right, thank you so much.